In 1921, Carl Jung published a book of almost 1,000 pages. Almost nobody read it. Not really. The world took one chapter from it, chapter 10, and built an entire personality industry on top of it. The tests, the 4 letters, the videos that tell you what your type orders at a restaurant. But deep inside that book, past the chapters nobody opens, Jung did something else. He wrote portraits, not categories, not labels, portraits of inner lives. And 4 of those portraits, when you hear them today, more than a century later, describe the deep intuitives with a precision that feels almost invasive. One of them is you. I'm going to read you all 4, and I'm going to ask you to do something difficult. Don't skip ahead to yours, because Jung hid something inside these portraits. Each one carries a wound, and each one carries a warning. And the final portrait ends with the harshest sentence Jung ever wrote about people like you, followed by the most redemptive. Stay until that sentence. It reframes everything that comes before it. First, understand what you're about to hear. The book is called Psychological Types, and Jung never wrote about 16 types in it. That came later, from other hands. What Jung described were orientations of the soul, attitudes, functions. And when he described the introverted ones, the ones whose life flows inward, he was describing something he knew from the inside. Jung was one of you. So these portraits were not written by a scientist observing specimens. They were written by a man describing his own kind. That's why they cut so deep. 4 portraits: the silent flame, the hidden judge, the architect of visions, and the one who cries in the wilderness. Let's begin. The first portrait is the introverted feeling type. If you carry the letters INFP, this is your page in the book. Jung opens with an old proverb, "Still waters run deep." And then he describes a person who is mostly silent, inaccessible, hard to understand. Someone who often hides behind a mask that looks childish or even banal, while their temperament leans quietly toward melancholy. They neither shine nor reveal themselves. Listen to that again. They neither shine nor reveal themselves. In a world that measures feeling by its display, Jung describes a person whose feeling is so deep that it cannot afford display. And then comes the part that will hurt, because you have lived it. Jung says, this type develops feeling in depth, not in breadth. Most people's sympathy is extensive. It flows outward in words, in gestures, in visible comfort, and then it returns to normal. But your sympathy is intensive. It has no outlet. It sinks. And Jung says something devastating about what happens next. A sympathy that is shut off from every means of expression acquires a passionate depth that holds an entire world of misery inside it. And then it goes numb. You know this moment. You have stood in front of someone who was suffering, and inside you there was an ocean. Grief for them. Grief for the whole broken world they represented. And what came out of your mouth was almost nothing. A few flat words, maybe silence, and they thought you didn't care. Jung saw this 100 years ago. He wrote that to the outside world. This intensive sympathy looks like coldness because it does nothing visible. And then he gives the reason. And the reason is the story of your life. An extroverted consciousness is unable to believe in invisible forces. They cannot believe in what they cannot see, and everything essential about you is invisible. So, where does all that feeling go? Jung answers, it goes into secret places, into a private, hidden religiosity guarded from profane eyes, into poetry that no one is ever allowed to read, into an inner life so rich and so protected that the people closest to you may live beside you for years and never once see the flame. Still waters, but underneath, everything is burning. Hold on to that image, because the second portrait shows what happens when the depths freeze instead of burn. The second portrait is the introverted thinking type. If you carry the letters INTP, Jung wrote this one for you, and I have to warn you, this is the darkest portrait in the book. Jung gives this type a face, and the face is Immanuel Kant, the man who never left his hometown, whose neighbors could set their clocks by his walks, and who, from one small room, rebuilt the foundations of human knowledge. Jung says this type follows ideas the way the extrovert follows them, but in the reverse direction, inward, not outward. Intensity is the aim, not extensity, not more territory, deeper truth. But here is what it costs. Jung says that when another person stands before this type, that person gets a distinct feeling that they matter only in a negative way. In milder cases, they merely feel superfluous. In stronger cases, they feel warded off, like a disturbance. You never intended that, and Jung knows you never intended it. He says, you may be polite, amiable, kind, but underneath the courtesy, people sense something, a faint unease, as if the friendliness were a way of keeping them calm so they don't interrupt the real work happening inside. Your judgment, Jung says, appears cold, inflexible, arbitrary, not because it's wrong. Often it's right, but because it serves the idea and not the person, and people can feel the difference. Now comes the warning, and it is the darkest turn in the portrait, because Jung is not describing where you live. He is describing where this can lead, when the type intensifies and the door to the world stays shut too long. Not a diagnosis, a road, and Jung walks the whole length of it in a single breath. To guard the idea, you shut the world out, but the world does not vanish when you shut it out. It moves inside, and it attacks you from there. The few people still allowed close become everything, and everyone else gets the colder, shorter version of you. Your thinking deepens, but it stops reaching anyone, so the feeling you never let out leaks sideways as touchiness, a raw nerve where there used to be calm. And then the quiet catastrophe Jung names so precisely. You begin to confuse your truth with yourself. The idea and the person fuse. So now any criticism of the idea, however fair, feels like an attack on your existence, and you answer fair criticism with a cruelty that surprises even you. The ideas that were meant to feed people turn destructive, poisoned, in Jung's words, by the sediment of bitterness. And so you withdraw further, certain that solitude will finally protect you. It won't. It only hands you to the thing it was meant to save you from. The fortress and the prison are the same building. If you felt that portrait in your chest, stay with me, because the third portrait is where thinking meets vision, and the stakes get higher. The third portrait belongs to introverted intuition. And here, Jung describes something strange, a person whose primary act is perception, but perception turned entirely inward. Someone who does not perceive the world, someone who perceives what is behind the world. Jung says this type produces the mystical dreamer and seer on the one hand, the artist and the crank on the other. Sit with that lineup for a moment. Dreamer, seer, artist, crank. Your whole life, you have been sliding between those four names in the mouths of other people. And here is where Jung's single introverted intuitive splits into two roads, because the same inward vision can be seized by two different powers, and which power seizes it decides the whole shape of a life. On the first road, a powerful intellect takes hold of the perception and systematizes it, builds it into comprehensible thought, into frameworks, into strategy, into architecture. This is the road modern typology calls INTJ. You are not someone who merely has ideas. You are someone who receives a vision and then spends years constructing the machinery to make it real. But now the wound, and this one does not look like a wound from the outside. It looks like strength. The world calls you cold, and somewhere, quietly, you have half believed it because you have felt how little reaches your face when something moves you underneath. Jung points somewhere else. He says, the intensification of intuition removes you further and further from tangible reality. And here is what that actually means. Not in a textbook, but in a kitchen, across a dinner table, in a bed at 2 in the morning. You are not cold because you feel nothing. You are cold because you are loyal to a future nobody else has agreed to yet. You have seen a possible reality so clearly that the present has started to feel like an obstacle. The people in front of you are real, but the vision is also real. And on the hardest days, the vision is more real than they are. That is the danger no one warns you about. Not that you cannot see the world, but that you see a world that does not exist yet so vividly that the one everyone else is living in begins to feel thin, provisional, something to be gotten through on the way to the real thing. Jung saw where this ends. He writes that you may become a complete enigma even to your closest circle. They see the discipline, they see the plans, they have no idea that all of it is in service of something you saw once, inwardly, and have never been able to fully explain to a single living person. They love the architect. They have never met the thing the architect is building for. And there is a question stalking this road. Jung says most intuitives try to avoid it because the pure perceiver only wants the next vision, the next perception, the next pattern. But sooner or later, the vision itself turns toward you and asks, what does this mean for me or for the world? What duty comes out of this? What task? The moment you answer that question, you stop being an observer of your visions. You become responsible for them. And that responsibility is where the first road ends and the second begins. The fourth portrait is that second road, the same introverted intuition. But now the vision is not seized by intellect. It is bound to feeling, to value, to meaning. This is the road modern typology calls INFJ, and Jung is now describing you at the exact point where your gift becomes your cross. Jung says this intuitive reflects on the meaning of the vision, and through that reflection, something irreversible happens. You realize, often only darkly, that you yourself are involved in the vision, that it is not just something to be perceived. Jung writes that the vision wants to participate in the life of the subject. The vision wants your life. And so, Jung says, this person feels bound to transform the vision into their own life, to live it, to become it. And here, Jung writes one of the most beautiful and most tragic sentences in the entire book. This person makes themselves and their life symbolic, adapted to the inner and eternal meaning of events, but unadapted to present-day reality. You belong to the eternal, and you pay for it in the currency of the present, because now comes the isolation. Your language, Jung says, is not the one currently spoken. It has become too subjective. Your arguments lack the convincing power of ordinary reason. You cannot prove what you know. You can only profess it, proclaim it. And then Jung reaches for the oldest image there is. His, he writes, is the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Every prophet in every myth stood exactly where you are standing, seeing what others do not yet see, speaking a language that will only make sense to them later, or never. And now, the sentence I promised you. Jung steps back and looks at these inward types, the dreamers, the seers, the ones who cannot make themselves understood. And he writes that from the extroverted and rationalistic standpoint of our world, such people are indeed the most useless of men. The most useless of men. Let it land. Because that sentence is not Jung's verdict. It is the world's verdict, and you have heard it your whole life in 1,000 softer forms. Too quiet, too intense, too impractical, too much in your head. What do you actually do? And then Jung turns and answers the world. But viewed from a higher standpoint, he writes, these people are living evidence that this rich and varied world, with its overflowing and intoxicating life is not purely external. It also exists within. You are the evidence. Your existence is the proof that there is an inside to reality, that the visible world is not the whole world. Jung goes further. He calls these types, in their own way, educators and promoters of culture. And then he gives them the sentence that should be carved somewhere. You can see it every morning. Their life teaches more than their words. 4 portraits. The silent flame, whose love goes numb before it reaches the surface. The hidden judge, whose truth turns bitter in isolation. The architect, who builds real structures out of invisible visions. And the voice in the wilderness, who must live a meaning no one else can yet see. 4 different faces, 1 wound. Jung names it in the summary. These types are mostly underestimated or misunderstood. What is happening inside them is so captivating, so inexhaustible, that they never notice how little of it actually reaches other people. Fragments. That's all the world receives from you. Fragments, delivered without the warmth that carries conviction. And the world judges the fragments because the world cannot see the cathedral they fell from. But Jung does not leave you with permission to hide, and neither will I, because he adds one final warning, and it is addressed to all 4 of you. He says that our forbearance toward these types must not go so far as to exempt them from the need to communicate. That exemption, he writes, would only do them the greatest harm. Your silence is not your protection. It is your slow destruction. The flame must find a form. The judge must let the idea be touched. The architect must translate the vision. The prophet must keep speaking into the wilderness, even when nothing answers. Not because the world deserves your inner life, but because you do not survive keeping it buried. Jung wrote your portrait in 1921, before you were born, before your parents were born. He saw you. He named your wound, your shadow, and your task, and he left the verdict standing where anyone could find it, on a page almost nobody reads. The world may call you the most useless of men. Jung called you the evidence. Which road was yours? Don't just tell me the letters. Tell me the name. Comment 1 phrase and 1 only. Silent flame, hidden judge, architect, or wilderness voice. And if you recognized someone else in these portraits, someone you love, send this to them before they disappear further into themselves. It might be the first time they feel seen by a book written a century ago.